The Egyptian Empire. It was the first great kingdom the world had ever known, a civilization built on stone, sand, and faith, and the belief that time itself could be conquered. It began around 3150 before Christ, when Upper and Lower Egypt were united under one crown. The Nile became its heartbeat, flooding each year, bringing life to a land of death. And from that rhythm, an empire was born. They called their rulers pharaohs, gods in human form, who believed they could rule not only the living but eternity itself. Every monument they built, every tomb they carved, was a promise to the afterlife. They didn't build for decades, they built for forever. By the New Kingdom, Egypt reached its golden age. Pharaohs like Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Ramesses II led armies beyond the sands, conquering Nubia to the south and Canaan to the north. Temples rose toward the sky, and the gods, Ra, Osiris, and Amun, seemed eternal. But even eternity has a weakness. Inside the temples, priests began to rival kings. Corruption spread through palaces. The Nile's floods, once so faithful, grew uncertain. Harvests failed and faith faltered. Then came Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. He abandoned Egypt's ancient gods for one, the Aten, the sun itself. For a moment, he believed he could reshape eternity. Instead, he broke the foundation of his own empire. After his death, his name was erased, his city abandoned, and his faith forgotten. By the time of Ramesses III, Egypt was fighting on every front, against invaders, hunger, and itself. The Sea Peoples came from the north. Libyans raided from the west. Each victory cost more than the last, until even triumph felt like defeat. When Ramesses XI died around 1070 before Christ, the empire split in two. Priests ruled the south, generals ruled the north. The kingdom that once built pyramids for gods could no longer feed its own people, and yet they refused to accept death. They mummified kings, carved prayers into stone, and filled tombs with gold, convinced life would continue beyond the veil. They built for the next world because they knew this one wouldn't last. The Egyptian empire didn't fall in a single night. It faded slowly across centuries. It chased immortality and found only ruins. But maybe that's the secret. Because while every empire since has risen and fallen, only Egypt still stands. Not in power, but in memory. The Roman Empire. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it fell in slow motion. It began as a dream in the dust, a small kingdom by the Tiber River that would one day rule the known world, founded, they said, by brothers raised by a wolf, Romulus and Remus. Its origins were half myth, half prophecy. But the legend became real. Through discipline, ambition, and the promise of eternal glory, Rome rose from a humble village into an empire that would shape the next 2,000 years. By the 1st century, Rome had become the beating heart of civilization. Its roads stretched for 50,000 miles, binding together more than 70 million people. Its armies marched with precision, its laws defined justice, and its architecture reached for the heavens. The Colosseum, the aqueducts, the marble forums, they weren't just monuments. They were proof that Rome believed it was eternal. Under Augustus, the first emperor, came the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of peace and prosperity. Trade flourished, cities glowed with art and knowledge, and from Britain to Egypt, the eagle of Rome cast its shadow. To the world it seemed unstoppable, an empire blessed by the gods. But even gods cannot stop decay. Wealth bred corruption, senators sold their loyalty, emperors rose and fell, some murdered by their own guards before sunrise. The people, once proud citizens, became spectators, fed on bread and entertained by blood. Rome's strength turned to spectacle, its unity to chaos. Then came Constantine the Great, the emperor who sought to restore Rome's glory. He embraced Christianity, reshaped its faith, and in 330 AD moved the empire's capital east to Byzantium, later called Constantinople. But in doing so, he split the empire in two, east and west, 2 Romes, 2 destinies. The eastern half would endure, but the west grew weak, drained by wars and greed. Barbarian tribes pressed harder at the borders, sensing the cracks in an empire that once seemed immortal. In 410 AD, the impossible happened. Rome was sacked by the Visigoths, and in 476, the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. The eternal city, the empire that ruled the world, had fallen. But perhaps that was always its destiny. Rome's greatest enemy was never the barbarians at its gates. It was time, patient, silent, and undefeated. The Mongol Empire. An empire isn't always born from stone and cities. Sometimes it rises from the wind and dust of endless steppes. In 1206, a man named Temujin stood on the banks of the Onon River and took a new name, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. What began as a federation of nomadic tribes would become the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the shores of the Mediterranean, connecting worlds that had never touched before. Within decades, the Mongols had conquered more territory than Rome did in centuries. Their mounted archers moved like ghosts across the landscape. Their strategies were brutal and brilliant, and their ambition knew no borders. By the late 13th century, Mongol rule spanned 9 million square miles. They didn't just conquer, they unified. The Silk Road flourished under their protection. Ideas and goods flowed freely between East and West, and for a time, it seemed that the Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, might last forever. But empires built on conquest carry the seeds of their own destruction. The cracks appeared not from outside enemies, but from within the royal family itself. When Mongke Khan died in 1259, his brothers went to war. Kublai Khan claimed the throne in China, but Arik Boka declared himself ruler in Mongolia. Civil war erupted. The empire that had been forged by one man's vision began to splinter under the ambitions of his grandsons. By 1294, when Kublai died, the Mongol Empire had fractured into 4 separate khanates, each pursuing its own path, its own identity. And then came something no army could defeat: the Black Death. The plague swept through the empire in the 1340s, killing millions, severing trade routes, and plunging the khanates into chaos. In China, the Mongol rulers grew distant from the people they governed. They never understood the agricultural heartland they controlled, never truly connected with Chinese civilization. Peasants revolted, not at first as nationalists, but as desperate farmers crushed by taxes and neglect. A former monk named Zhu Chongba led the rebellion, and in 1368 he drove the Mongols from Beijing, founding the Ming dynasty. One by one, the khanates crumbled. The Ilkhanate fell in 1335. The Yuan dynasty fled to the steppes. The Golden Horde fractured into warring tribes. By 1687, the last remnants had vanished. The Mongol Empire had ruled the world, but it could not rule itself. For in the end, the greatest threat to any empire is not the enemy at the gate. It's division, disease, and the quiet rebellion of those that forgot to understand. The British Empire. There was a time when the world was painted red, an empire so vast, so powerful, that the sun never set on its territories because somewhere a British flag was flying under daylight. At its height in 1920, the British Empire ruled over 412 million people, nearly a quarter of humanity, and stretched across 13.7 million square miles. From the deserts of Africa to the jungles of Asia, from the frozen north of Canada to the islands of the Pacific, Britain commanded them all. It had risen through naval supremacy, industrial revolution, and ruthless ambition. Its ships controlled the oceans, its banks controlled the trade, and its culture spread across continents. The Pax Britannica, the British peace, defined an entire century. It seemed eternal, unshakable, destined to last forever. But ambition, unchecked, becomes its own prison. The First World War shattered the illusion. Britain emerged victorious. Its territory expanded to the largest it would ever be, but at a devastating cost. Millions dead, the economy strained, and a generation lost. The empire had grown too vast to defend, too expensive to maintain. And across its colonies, whispers of independence began to rise. Then came the Second World War. Britain stood defiant against Nazi Germany, but the cost was catastrophic. By 1945, the nation was essentially bankrupt, surviving only through a massive American loan. The fall of Singapore in 1942 had shattered British prestige in Asia. The impregnable fortress had fallen in days, revealing to the world that Britain could no longer protect its empire. The balance of power had shifted. The United States and the Soviet Union now stood at the center of the world stage. In 1947, India, the jewel in the crown, gained independence. 14 million people were displaced in the partition. The empire's greatest possession was gone. But the final blow came in 1956, at Suez. When Egypt's Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain invaded, but America refused to support the operation and threatened to collapse the British currency if they didn't withdraw. Humiliated, Britain retreated. It was called Britain's Waterloo, the moment the world saw, undeniably, that Britain was no longer a great power. The wind of change swept through Africa in the 1960s. Colony after colony declared independence. By 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back to China, the empire was gone. The British Empire hadn't been defeated by enemies. It had been exhausted by 2 world wars, bankrupted by its own ambitions, and abandoned by history. For in the end, even the empire on which the sun never set must face the night. If you made it this far, thank you. Make sure to subscribe for more stories like this, and let me know in the comments which moment in history you'd like to see next.